A somber glory crowned her hearse as the cortege crawled slowly through the streets of London. Victoria had ruled the mightiest empire in the world. The price of British preeminence had been an industrial revolution. With it went a revolution in the way society dealt with death.
At the beginning of Victoria's reign, most people still lived in villages and on the land, like here at Swanbourne in Buckinghamshire. It was a society largely dominated by the parson and the squire. In Swanbourne, the manor stood directly opposite the parish church. And the parsonage, of course, was next door. This cycle of life in rural parishes went on much as it had for centuries. The church stood at the center. Here, the newborn were baptized. Here, in communal ground, their mortal remains were buried. Villagers and servants, the parson and the squire with his family amongst them.
The traditional way of death was transformed with the progress of the Industrial Revolution. By 1837, when Victoria ascended the throne, people were thronging the industrial towns and cities. There they experienced a new cycle of life. At its center was no longer the parish church, but the mill. Life had never been easy in the country, but in cities like Manchester, conditions were generally much worse. Housing was dense and overcrowded. The air was clogged with smoke and fumes. Inside the mills, entire families worked in 12-hour shifts just to feed and clothe themselves. A young girl in the 1840s could expect to tend a spinning mule that replaced 3,000 girls like her working by hand. In the city, she could also expect to live only half as long as she would have in the country, an average of 17 years from birth. Accidents at work were common, but the main reason for this miserable life expectancy was infant mortality. Over 50% of children in Manchester died before the age of 5. Large families were insurance against pauperism in old age and the workhouse. Victorian respectability centered on the notion of the family, but poverty and poor living conditions denied this status to countless couples. In any case, for those on subsistence wages, the cost of a family grave was prohibitive. Public cemeteries, like Phillips Park in Manchester, catered for rich and poor. Past these middle-class graves, beneath the grass, lie thousands of Victorian paupers, buried in common graves, free of charge.
Paupers were buried in graves like this modern one. Beneath me here are at least half a dozen Victorian coffins. When this grave is filled, the coffins will be stacked up to 20 deep.
At Harper Hay, a private cemetery opened in 1836, the newly rich middle classes thronged the main driveway. But a bargain burial was also possible. At the back of the cemetery, crowded together behind a gate, we find examples of the cheapest kind of memorial. A simple inscription on a plain stone above a common grave cost a shilling or two.
The year on this stone is 1884. Below it are the basic facts of burial: the name, the date of death, and the age. There's no information about the families. Bodies were just buried here as they arrived. Before long, these stones will have disappeared, just like the ones that used to stand behind them. 86,000 people, working people, are buried here.
Again, grass will be the only monument to their lives. Their memorials sacrificed for a landscaped park. Middle-class families in Manchester had up to twice the life expectancy of the working poor, but 30-odd years was still very low. The reason again was infant mortality.
Take this family, for instance. 6 of the children died in infancy. William at 7 months, Frederick at 2 years. Susanna Alice, she lived 2 years as well. Richard and Joseph both died at 13 months. Esther died at 18 months. And the 7th child, the last child, Sarah Louise, lived the longest. She died at the age of 7. By that time, her mother, Emily, had died, and she was 35. The husband, John, he died at 57, 10 years later. What's significant about this grave is that we can see what happened to the family. This is an expensive gravestone, solid granite. It survived in almost perfect condition for 100 years. We don't know exactly how well off the family was, but we do know they could afford to erect a monument like this in an exclusive part of the cemetery.
But for the really rich, immortality? What king or saint lies encased in granite inside this marble mausoleum? In the shadow of Brookfield Unitarian Church in the industrial suburb of Gorton, a Gothic canopy covers the tomb and family vault of a great industrialist, Richard Peacock. Peacock embodied the image of the self-made, philanthropic industrialist. He was a partner in the great Bayer-Peacock Railway Engineering Works, a Liberal MP, an art collector, and he paid for the Unitarian Church and the local school. Temporal and spiritual guardian of Gorton, he lived in Gorton Hall, a fine mansion replaced shortly after his death with rows of housing. Only the gatehouse survives, and his tomb. Instead of saints guarding the Gothic tomb, we find Peacock's employees. The smith, the engineer, the draftsman, and an allegory of fame holds out a laurel wreath.
The Industrial Revolution brought wealth and death on a new scale. Neither was distributed with impartiality. In country churchyards, remembrance of the dead depended on a sense of local community. In the anonymity of industrial cities, it depended on what one could afford. Of course, most people still believed in personal immortality. But with growing affluence, the middle classes became concerned with immortality in this life. People wanted their bodies as well as their names to be preserved. Death itself was opened up to commercial exploitation.
East London was a boom town in the early 19th century, with new docks opening along the Thames. Today the docks have died, but St. Paul's Shadwell still preserves the mortal remains of those who prospered. The church is built on a basement covering capacious vaults. There, Julian Litten of the Victorian Albert Museum is advising on conservation.
Unlike the medieval church, with its intermittent burial, intermural burial, the 19th century did things better. When they built their churches, they deliberately constructed areas beneath, mini reproductions of the architecture above, which were then used as burial vaults. These vaults were sold off on a freehold basis, held in perpetuity by the family who owned the freehold, and burial was used in them right up until the late 19th century, when particular acts of Parliament meant that all of the vaults, certainly in Greater London, were closed to further burials. Let's have a look at one of these vaults and see the quality of the fixtures and fittings inside. This is to Messrs. Saunders and Norris. They certainly would have been of grand tradesmen's occupations. They could have been owners of local factories, even warehouse owners in this particular part of up-and-coming London. The fittings that we can see are all of iron, stamped iron. The fixtures themselves follow distinct funerary heraldry. The coffin on the right-hand side has within its grip plate a shield. And we know that this shield shape would be used for a male. On the left-hand side, on the lid, we can see a weeping female figure underneath a weeping willow. She is sitting on top of a little plinth, and on the plinth are two inverted torches showing that life is extinguished, and there's a wreath of immortelles in between those two torches. The coffins were exceedingly elaborate, covered in velvet, but the motifs on the lid themselves opened up a new and variant way for expressing one's grief. But the center coffin has something a little bit grander. We can see a grip plate of two winged Baroque cherubs' heads, a cast iron grip of swags of roses, starburst escutcheons in the corner of the head end, whilst over the face itself, more star escutcheons, but two angels supporting a crown. Loosely interpreted, that would mean, be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown of life. In the 18th century, the manufacture of the inner wooden coffin, the lead shell that went round it, and the outer case with its luxurious velvet and fittings, was the responsibility of different tradespersons. The man who acted as the middleman between them and the family was known as an undertaker. But in the 19th century, undertakers became what is now known as the funeral director. He employed within his workshops plumbers, cabinet makers, upholsterers, metalworkers, and they were able to provide on the premises the full package deal. The ritual of mourning, which is an outward and visible sign of an inward and private grief, is certainly not something which is peculiar to the 19th century. But the 19th century did have something which no other previous time before it did. It used its industry and also its technology in producing particular goods associated with the mourning trade. Obviously, this sort of mourning jewellery was an enormous outlet to the small jewellers in the town. One could get, indeed, personalised jewellery. You always find in particular trades that someone prefers a little bit grander than the man next door. If we take something of this quality, which is a pigeon blood ruby ring, this particular item would only have been made as a special one-off. Particular patterns and use was made from the hair of the deceased. I'm sure all of us at some time have seen, when looking through Granny's treasures, hair jewellery such as this, a hair cross. We also have an example of a hair watch chain which would have been worn by the male in the family. I don't think it would be fair to say that all of this hair jewellery is made from the hair of the deceased person. Certainly when one is thinking of a watch chain, one would almost have to shave the entire head of the cadaver and send it to the coffin as bald as a coot. Well, that just was not to be done. What you would do would be to take a sample of hair into the jeweller's shop, show it to the assistant behind the counter, and he will be able to offer to you a selection of ready woven samples of hair.
The death industry experienced a lively trade for the rest of the century. Corpses were plentiful, customers were discerning and rich. But where could they dispose of their bodies in a suitably impressive way? Church vaults had been sold off, and churchyards were overflowing. The answer lay with a few far-sighted entrepreneurs.
A young architect and engineer, Stephen Geary, formed the London Cemetery Company to cater for bourgeois burials. He opened the cemetery at Highgate in North London in 1839. It was set on 17 acres of hillside overlooking the world's largest and wealthiest city. And soon it became the nation's most fashionable necropolis. Geary promoted his bright new venture using fashionable architectural styles. A grandiose Tudor gateway, flanked by Gothic chapels, leads to shady porticos where mourners awaited the hearse. Lines from Tennyson's In Memoriam offered mourners cold comfort on their way to the tombs.
There sat the shadow feared of man, who broke our fair companionship, and spread his mantle dark and cold, and wrapped thee formless in the fold, and dulled the murmur on my lip, and bore thee where I would not see nor follow, though I walk in haste, and think that somewhere in the waste the shadow sits and waits for me.
Tennyson's In Memoriam epitomized the Victorian brooding over death. Doubts about heaven and hell were prevalent among the middle classes. Their anxious hopes for individual immortality can be seen in the individualism of their graves.
An exemplary and devoted husband, a kind and generous friend, an unostentatious gentleman, surely missed by many.
The soldier with his decorations. The Gothic revival architect, Bloor. A signed grave. Sir John Singleton Copley, 3 times Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain. A store owner, John Maple of Tottenham Court Road. A cricketer bowled out. Wombwell, a menagerist. A prize fighter with his faithful mourner. Few Victorian women are commemorated here in their own right. Famous novelists are an exception. Like an old-fashioned club, the cemetery seems a masculine preserve, a place to praise great men rather than weep for them. The heroic sentiment at Highgate is often expressed through pagan and classical allusions. The mourner with downturned torch. The draped urn. The broken column. Christian symbolism also abounds. But the leading motif of the cemetery's interior is drawn from pagan cultures of the ancient Near East. A pharaonic arch flanked by obelisks and Egyptian columns, it marks the entrance to a Valley of the Kings, a self-contained community of the dead cut into the steepest part of the hillside. The Egyptian avenue, lined with 16 burial vaults, leads into the Circle of Lebanon.
Here in the Circle of Lebanon, there are 20 more vaults set around an ancient cedar. They have Egyptian-style lintels and massive iron doors, and each one of them holds 15 coffins. For 200 guineas, a Victorian family could purchase the consolation that here one day they would be reunited in gloomy splendor. The dynasty would be preserved.
Nearby, however, towers a monument to cast lesser families in the shade. The ground alone on which it stands cost £800. The mausoleum cost £5,000. Built in 1876, it was modeled on one of the 7 wonders of the world, the burial chamber of King Mausolus at Halicarnassus. The vault of the upper chapel features sumptuous mosaics by Salviati. Beer was an immigrant financier who made his money on the stock exchange. He owned the Observer newspaper, which his son inherited on his death in 1880. The bas-relief is by Armstead, who worked on the Albert Memorial. The son's wife was a member of the rich Sassoon family. She owned and edited the Sunday Times. Nothing but the best for Julius Beer.
Just as the Beer mausoleum dominates the entire cemetery, so it gives a fair impression of changing Victorian values. At Highgate, secularization was going on. The wealthy dead were likened to self-made pharaohs and kings. Their hope of immortality was not confined to Christian symbols. The mighty monuments of pagan antiquity signified the permanent value they attached to commercial and professional success. There were other ways to preserve one's reputation.
On his death in 1832, Jeremy Bentham left orders that his remains should be prepared and dressed in his usual attire. He proposed that from time to time his colleagues here at University College London might remind themselves of his services by trundling this box into their gatherings. The usefulness of this scheme may well be questioned, although Bentham was the great philosopher of utilitarianism. The more usual resting place of national heroes was Westminster Abbey. Death is swallowed up in victory in the English pantheon. Here, those who have made Britain great are granted eternal life. Eminent Victorians peer down from plinth and wall, oblivious of the forces that put them there or the ironies they represent. Charles Darwin, after all, was an unbeliever.
The immortalization in Westminster Abbey of individuals such as Darwin is a comment on the social, political, and cultural history of the Victorian age. Statesmen, like Disraeli, held the reins of power, but industry held the keys of the kingdom. To those who could afford it, heaven and hell in the vague hereafter seemed less important than immortality here and now. Secularization and industrialization went hand in hand. No one would have deplored this change more than the Christian statesmen who presided over it through 4 administrations. Gladstone's burial here is ironic evidence that forces were at work in Victorian society which not even he could withstand.
Since I was born, I started